So welcome, Christine. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you so much also for helping me all along this rather difficult process of trying to write about China that you know so well and that I know so little.
Yes, I think many of us who've been there a long time, and Serge Dumont is our co-chair here, the president of Asia Society France, has been, like myself, living in Beijing for decades. We tend to be more here now. We have many friends who are long-time, Bruno, many friends, Stephanie, Alison. Many people here used to live in China and are now living in France or nearby and looking from afar. I still live in and out of China, but it is getting more difficult, obviously, to understand what's going on. So I salute your courage for taking on this important task. Serge, do you want to say anything before we start the event? Yeah. Okay. Welcome. Yes, welcome.
Usually Serge has a lot to say.
Well, exactly.
This is your part.
But please keep your questions. We'll start off with just a general conversation and then open the floor. But I must say, I almost think there's a spelling mistake on the cover. Don't worry, it's a joke. L'Empereur et les Milliardaires Rouges. I think it's millionnaire because a lot of the billionaires now are millionaires. Again, there's been such destruction, actually, of wealth. For some of the high-profile tech companies, but many others, some of which was zero COVID, of course, but a lot of which was the government's campaign against large, particularly the big tech companies. And so some of the most high-profile, billionaires in China come from the tech sector. But what I really like in your book is that you go back to what many people call as the original sin of Hainan. So the island of Hainan comes up a lot in your descriptions of various entrepreneurs. And that was really the beginning, I think, of the Wild West in China, like basically 79, 80. So I really like how you have a very broad lens on this. But when you chose the people that you wrote about, there are many different types. How did you select the people that you wrote about?
Well, the most difficult approach was indeed the selection and also trying to diversify because I started thinking, we know nothing about these people who have done a remarkable achievement, which is actually to build the second economy in the world in just 2 generations. And so when having no knowledge, unfortunately, of the language, I had a very good researcher who has founded a small company called East is Red, Noé Hirsch. And so with his help, we started very basically with the Hurun list.
Right.
And then we started to make a selection. And when we started to gather some material about those people, I realized that, first of all, it was very difficult for me to memorize their names in the first place. And second, many of them had very similar trajectories. Right. And so I said, oh my God, that's going to be very boring, especially for an audience at large. I have no pretense whatsoever to be an expert. But as a journalist, what I have come to realize is that if we don't understand better how China works, we will be more and more mesmerized on the one hand, and more at a loss at the other hand to try and understand how the Chinese Xi Jinping power system works. So I figured that going through a few of these people and trying to trace, in fact, their own trajectories within the larger framework of Chinese economic expansion, immediately one wonders about Xi Jinping, because after all, he's been around almost for 11 years now. And it's really through his approach to the entrepreneurs class, his approach to corruption, his approach to cleansing for obvious political purposes, but also to some extent to try and prevent the widening of the gap between the ultra-rich and the emerging middle class. I mean, there are all sorts of very interesting factors that I think we need to understand. And so that's how I started to make a selection. And eventually, of course, one cannot help but write about Jack Ma and reading your excellent biography of Ma was, of course, very helpful. But beyond Ma, I mean, it came as a surprise to me that the richest of them all, and I guess he's still a billionaire, is the king of mineral water.
Water, yes. And
that is something, that's a character who is virtually unknown in the West and certainly in Europe. So that's how I proceeded, and then, I had to make some choices, and obviously I couldn't cover as much as I could, and the situation kept evolving. For instance, the Tencent Ponima not being reconducted last March at the Consultative Assembly was a very interesting moment. But of course, ever since the book was published, which is exactly a month ago, many, many events have happened which show how contradictory the system has become between ideology on the one hand and the need for economic pragmatism on the other to try and spur the economy.
Well, I think your timing was good, though. You were able to capture, the new standing committee, the Politburo, the new government, the balloon incident, so I can imagine you were editing up to the very moment. Yes. It's nonstop, China these days. But yeah, I lazily went to write about Jack Ma because I had luckily met him, and also his name was Jack Ma. I mean, but you're right, when you get into the details, even the towns where people are from, the names of the companies, it takes effort, but I think you do it very well. And I think you really show the different waves that came of entrepreneurship. The Hainan story, which, Hainan only became a province, I believe, in 79 or 80. It was when it became a province, there was this mad rush. You talk about people importing cars and selling them. A lot of the fortunes that were made, the early fortunes, were made through Hainan and this just laissez-faire kind of attitude. But you also write a lot about the property sector, which is very important. I mean, as you describe, I think 40–50% of most individuals' wealth is tied up, and therefore there's a lot of pressure right now on the Chinese economy.
And a lot of these people started in the property sector, right. and then, of course, would diversify.
Yeah, you were saying people would get up on the first floor, and by the time they get to the fifth floor, they've sold that building and on to the next. That really was the Wild West. I arrived in 94, but it was really from the late 70s and early 80s where we saw, this craziness. I guess it was late 80s for Hainan, I think. But then I think so we've had the Hainan thing, we've had the tech thing, the real estate thing, and then the tech, the internet connected to China in 94, but it didn't really become mainstream for a couple of years. And Jack Ma, you mentioned Tencent, these two Ma's become these iconic figures. And they both had very different approach to working with government.
Yeah, and apparently they have an intense dislike for one another, from what can read. And then there's a third Ma, but then I understand it's a very common name. And I wrote about him, that the third Ma, who is the big insurance guy, who's been asked by the regime to actually split HSBC.
That's right.
And that's an ongoing process as well.
Yeah, and what you describe, with companies like HSBC, but more broadly, Western companies in China now. In the early days, of course, they came in and they did joint ventures with the government. But the rise of these large private companies created a sort of third section of the economy, competing with some of the Western companies. And you mentioned the water company with Danone having a famous falling out. So you have this interesting tripartite split between the state enterprises, the private sector companies that you write about, and also the Western multinationals, and how this is all shaking out now. And you mentioned HSBC. They're currently both a very large bank in Asia, but also in the West, and they're kind of in a very difficult position. And we can go into companies like Apple and others that are almost Chinese companies.
Yes, that's what actually the boss of Apple actually said when he was in Beijing a few weeks ago. He said, well, Apple is in a way a Chinese company. I'm not sure his shareholders really approve. Yeah. But it's what is fascinating in the ideological uphold, which is obviously strengthening.
Yes.
And the events of the past few days are really extraordinary with Capvision,
correct,
Bain's, Mintz,
and consulting companies.
Now actually fearing for their own people.
That's right.
But what is extraordinary is that it's all these big tech, but not only, all these big Chinese corporations are all on the New York Stock Exchange. And Shine, and that's an extraordinary story because it's, 2 years old, and massive. That guy has actually joined the billionaire club. He wants also to be quoted in New York. So you have this extraordinary interdependence, interpenetration, in spite of the ideology. And then, in fact, at some point, the Communist Party catches up. And I guess that's the big question mark now. I mean, how could... I think the Chinese foreign minister is now touring Europe to try and convince us Europeans, and always in the Chinese approach, trying to do it on a bilateral way, because they consider it's much easier for them
divide and conquer.
To divide, if not conquer, but try and seduce. But at the same time, you know, Western corporations are being threatened in China. So, question marks.
And it's very interesting that some Chinese companies before in the private sector would never really bother much with markets outside China because the market was growing so rapidly. But in recent years, as you mentioned, Shein and now Temu and others are, you know, increasingly looking overseas because it's less regulated than China. I mean, the private sector in China is quite nervous about random acts by the government. We saw that, and you write a lot about the education and training sector, which, you know, very thriving companies, which for ideological reasons suddenly were targeted because they were seen to be profiting from, you know, exam obsession of parents, etc. But we saw hundreds of thousands of jobs actually wiped out in the space of weeks.
From one day to the next.
Yeah. And you also mentioned about the unemployment challenge, which is real now. I think 20% of, you know, the 18 to 24-year-olds in China are looking for work, and many are now continuing their studies if their parents can afford it, because they don't want to go into the job market right now. And if they do, they're looking at the state sector, and you write about that.
But they all, yeah, exactly. Yeah. They apply for this. Or I even read a piece, I think, in The Economist lately, where they go for manual work. I mean,
That's
people
right.
who've gone through these extraordinary, strenuous way to get diplomas, and then they go back to working with their hands because it's more reliable.
And as a consumer in Beijing, I see it. You know, a lot of the delivery guys and gals mostly guys, but from Meituan, 40% I think actually have university degrees. I mean, the people delivering. You know, so this, I'm not sure how sustainable this is. I only have a bachelor's degree. Most of my everybody else has a master's and PhD. I'm very undereducated in China, but when I understand less than the people delivering things, I mean, that's an issue, I think. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's the need to create jobs. We've always thought, I mean, the social contract we thought was economy first, you know, prosperity. The Communist Party will endure and thrive as long as the economy is stable. But now, as you say, there's some pretty, you know, Xi Jinping has taken on the big tech companies, but critically the property companies and many others at the same time. So this is, you know, what do you think is driving, and the relationship with the U.S., we have to think about this.
Oh, that's the huge issue, of course. But before we get into that, I think the property sector is fascinating, because it seems that now the party bosses in many major provinces are looking for money in the Gulf.
That's right.
And they go
Saudi and
to Saudi, to the Emirates directly, not going through the central financial institutions. And so what does it actually mean? They cannot sell any more land because obviously the system doesn't work anymore. And not only doesn't it work, but it's been a terrible failure, and it has fooled hundreds of thousands of people. But so the idea that, you know, the province of Sichuan or whatever would go to Abu Dhabi and say, please, can you lend us some money? Because how do you explain that, Duncan?
Well, I think the local governments, the cash, the ATM for local governments was the property sector, as you said, because they sell the land. Obviously, there's a lot of corruption, which was also part of Xi Jinping's crackdown, and that made him, as you described, somewhat popular in some areas. But also, the cost of zero COVID was so huge. I mean, on, you know, collapse of any income from other sources. And so the legacy of both the property crackdown and zero COVID, it seems a lot of local governments are, the tin is empty. We've seen some cities in China have actually formally declared bankruptcy, which is new. I mean, the idea is that typically you can just keep rolling it over, but it seems that's no longer quite possible. The government's under a lot of pressure. More broadly, China is orienting towards the global south. If they're sort of giving up on the United States in many ways as a trading partner, and it's obviously a huge export market for them. And the irony is US and China are still massive, commercial agreements. But in terms of new investments, there's a big look to the Middle East and other parts of the global south. They feel that the politics is not going to get in the way. And what I'm hearing is even more strict rules are coming down for investment by Chinese companies in the US. We haven't even seen the beginning of it. So, and as we just described before we started, it's a bipartisan initiative between the Democrats and Republicans, the only thing they agree on. And we're a long way to go to the elections.
Oh, yeah, no, it's going to get even more intense. And of course, on the Chinese side, it's quite obvious that although I think there was a meeting a few days ago with Jake Sullivan in Vienna, between Sullivan and the Chinese foreign minister. But still, I mean, and also the fact that we Europeans have, at long last, have come to realize that we cannot remain as dependent on the Chinese market as we have been on Russian gas. It's a huge issue for Germany, more so than France, if only because the German economy is so much bigger and so much more dependent on the Chinese market. But still, what von der Leyen said just before going to Beijing is a very interesting speech. The fact that, she forged that horrible new word like de-risking.
De-risking.
Not decoupling, but de-risking. But there's certainly a growing awareness within the EU that indeed the relations with China has to be reassessed somehow. And there will be a German-Chinese summit in Berlin in about 3 weeks, end of June, I believe. And that will be a very interesting moment because, again, the German automobile industry, chemical industry, they're very much dependent upon China. And so within the EU, it also creates tensions and misunderstandings.
Yes, we don't have very large German luxury brands that I can name, but France has a couple that we're quite aware of. So
there's not only luxury in life.
That's true. As a Brexit refugee in Paris, I mean, the fact that the Paris Stock Exchange has overtaken London, partly because of luxury and many other missteps in England, is remarkable. But you described the automobile sector, and how remarkable now is that China's becoming the largest exporter of automobiles in the world, and particularly in the electric vehicle sector, because of their strengths in batteries. What is Germany going to do? I mean, it may actually reduce their dependence by very quickly, unfortunately, on the Chinese market if they're pushed aside.
No, but the Chinese battery giants are very, very clever people. They're actually building plants in Germany, which is a way to circumvent eventual tariff protection. But the French, Macron just issued...
in Dunkirk, right?
A very interesting new dimension, saying that, we have to develop batteries that can compete with Chinese batteries, which are, I think, as much as I understood, it's another technology, and Chinese batteries are almost impossible to actually reuse or recycle, so they are much worse for the environment. I mean, there's also an environmental dimension to the issue, and not only an industrial one.
Yeah, so President Macron just 3 days ago, was in Dunkirk with a Taiwanese manufacturer expanding in France. So interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, so I think, as you describe in the book, I mean, Europeans have to make des choix de plus en plus difficiles, more and more difficult choices. How much autonomy do you think Europe really has versus the US on one side and this sort of dependence on China. Is it a false leverage that they have, or?
It's a real leverage, I believe, because Europe is just the largest market in the world, with 500 million consumers, with high standards of living, in spite of all our moaning and groaning.
Well, that's French. Right? You're Belgian, I think. Yeah.
Both.
Both. Okay,
that's why I may sound more optimistic.
Yes, no, I love that. Yeah.
But no, it's a huge leverage, and in fact, that's why again the Chinese are trying to be so nice to us. And try and convince us not to adjust to American-style sanctions, although the Netherlands,
yes.
Because they do have
semiconductor
industry, have indeed followed on the sanctions together with Japan, I believe.
Japan, exactly.
But no, we do have a huge leverage, and that's the market. And of course, we also have major investments in China, but again, from one country to the other, it's very different. Italy is a very interesting example, because Italy is a founding member of the EU, and yet it's the only European country to be part of the Belt and Road. And I think that Madame Meloni is actually reconsidering whether it's worth it or not. But again, these are fascinating times.
Yes, the irony, I mean, Italy did sign to join the Belt and Road Initiative, but actually the performance of Chinese investment is much worse than countries like France and Germany that did not enter that. So it seems like something is going on there. But yeah, so I think this is obviously going to be playing in the US-China political sphere, but it's going to be affecting all of us increasingly. Because the costs of, as you say, this ugly word of de-risking and decoupling, the costs are very high. I mean, we may not think, probably most of the things that we have around us that we're wearing were made in China, passed through, right. So if we really have to factor in the cost of full decoupling, I mean, it's actually impossible in the near term. But at the same time, companies are making moves to, as the Japanese pioneered, they called it the China +1 strategy. So you put a plant in China and you put one in Vietnam and so on. But now it's China +1+1+1+1, because China has become so large. It's going to take, in the case of companies like Apple, a very long time. But interesting, we are hearing that Apple is moving, or suppliers to Apple are moving some of the higher-end semiconductor capital equipment to places like Vietnam, because they're worried that they will not be able to, well, already they can't source certain semiconductors in
yes,
China.
And obviously the strike in the Fosun factory, when was that, November?
Oh, in Zhengzhou, actually, yeah. Foxconn. Yeah, Foxconn. Yes, correct.
And with that extraordinary pictures of hundreds of workers just getting out,
yeah.
beating the men in white and having the little trolleys.
I did 8 weeks of quarantine, but I knew not to run away because it doesn't end well. But at that point, the system was breaking apart. And how amazing that pivot that we had so quickly. I mean, I think it's perhaps overstated in the West that it was driven by the protests. I mean, as you said, there were many factors. But there was this massive
starting with that strike. I think the strike was in many ways much more of a warning.
That's right.
To Beijing than the protests with the white sheets.
And if you go to Zhengzhou, which is only, I think it's an hour and 10 minutes on the high-speed train from Beijing, I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of employees, or perhaps even millions, work for companies like Foxconn. And the local government is highly dependent on this investment. So yeah, we see this, and you also describe how Xi Jinping has personally taken control of, last count, is it 11 commissions? I mean, he's the chairman of everything. He's very good at consolidating power. The question is, how do you use this power in this deteriorating environment with the US and also deteriorating domestic demand? I mean, there's nobody to blame. We do have Li Qiang, a trusted ally of his, who he worked with previously as the prime minister. What are you hearing of? I mean, also Macron went to Beijing with a business delegation, also to Guangzhou.
Yeah, well, that's always the contradiction. Scholz did go last fall without asking any other European camarade. Macron had the very good idea to ask von der Leyen to go with him, but then, of course, the Chinese played it very well and with just a touch of cruelty,
to her,
which I think they know, they've known for thousands of years about, to sort of discriminate her in such a way.
Macron got tea and she didn't get tea or something. But
yes, and the length of the red carpet, there was all sorts of signs. But no, more seriously, yes, if you take Anna Baerbock, the German foreign minister, who followed Macron, I think she was in Beijing the week after. And she made all these wonderful speeches that we Europeans like to hear because she spoke about everything, including Uyghur and, human rights. But the same day or the day after, Volkswagen announced €1 million investment in China.
Billion, probably, I think.
Billion.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
You're much better with figures than I am. €1 billion. So that shows the European dilemma.
Yeah.
You have, the correct pattern of speech, but then hard facts.
Yeah. And so, one of the visions, and I think you described very well, that Xi Jinping has a very clear vision with dates and percentages and targets up to, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, the common prosperity, but also in the technology sphere, very clear goals that are set in areas like quantum computing, AI, EV. Obviously, we see a lot of success in EV. I guess my question, the risk is, and you described this dilemma, how much of the last success that China has had over these decades was not really anything to do with the government, or was indirectly to do with the government. Whereas where we're heading in the future, how much is the government going to be deriving,
I think that's the major question mark. And to me, the most extraordinary moment was about a month ago. On a Monday, I remember it was on a Monday, Alibaba announced its own chat GDP. On the Tuesday, the day after, the Commission of the Communist Party in charge of technology issued a statement saying that all tools of artificial intelligence have to abide by the criteria and the virtues of socialism, the Chinese way, according to Xi Jinping's thinking. So, how do you combine ChatGPT with Xi Jinping thinking, unless you extraordinarily reduce the impact of ChatGPT? Whatever, however expansive the thoughts of the leader may be. So, and that reminds me of Bill Clinton's remark
about the internet.
That the Chinese would never be able to control the internet because it was like trying to stick
nail Jello to the wall.
Jello to the wall. Well, actually,
they did.
They did. So, how is that going to apply to generative AI? That's
a fascinating question. And as you described, most of the leaders in China are very well trained in engineers. Whereas
and then the younger generation very well trained usually in the US.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's another dilemma we're seeing now between the sort of the security control camp versus the more engagement opening camp, particularly the local governments. They need the FDI, they need that tech transfer. But you're right. I think ChatGPT is it may be calmer. Because the Chinese internet, for generative AI, they crawl what's out there. But there's a lot of holes in what's out there because of censorship. And so there was this very funny example where I think this was on the Baidu Ernie ChatGPT, where they were asked to draw a patriotic mouse. And it came back was a mouse with an American flag. Because the code, I guess, was in the US, but they have to say, no, patriotic means a Chinese flag. There's all these, ChatGPT is, the topic around the world right now. But if it becomes as big as some say, China has a challenge.
It all has to do with data.
Right.
And of course, in terms of figures, the data is huge.
Massive.
Except that until now, or until last year, I think each conglomerate has its own data system,
That's right.
and they would not sort of correspond.
Right.
But now they have to. I think there has been again an order from above that they have to share and give the data to the central institution, so to speak.
The opposite of GDPR. It's GDP, I guess, when they're grabbing all the data.
Yeah, and so, but at the same time, I was talking about that with a young expert, because what is really staggering whenever you try and understand what AI is about is that you talk to people who are under 35.
Yeah,
I think that above 35, it's another story. And that expert was telling me that the problem is, of course, they eventually Chinese data will be huge, but it may be very poor data for the very reason you mentioned, because if censorship is so harsh, it will not include as broad resources as it may in the Western.
The technical term is garbage in, garbage out, I think, but
that's
sort of an ersatz. I mean, in a sense, I mean, this, but what is the Americans? What is the game of the Americans to really give no off ramp to China with these increasing restrictions on semiconductors and other aspects? Some have compared it. I think it was David Bevarez I was speaking to, the Helsinki Accords, where the U.S. kind of nudged the Soviet Union in pursuing the wrong direction, knowing that it would actually fail. I mean, do you think the U.S. is that sophisticated that they're nudging China into the direction with technology, which is they know is not going to work?
No, and I'm not sure the comparison stands, frankly, even dating back to the Soviet Union. But I think it has to do with also with a very, how could I put it politely, the very blurred line in the Chinese system between what is the industry and what is the military. Now, it's a blurred line in every system, including the US.
Raytheon or whoever.
Sure. But obviously much more so for all the obvious reasons in China.
And I moved to China in '94 when it was becoming clearer in the other way. I mean, you had people like Premier Zhu Rongji who pushed in, '96 or so, separation of military and commercial. And so, I mean, the bizarre thing, certainly for me and maybe for Serge and others, is we're sort of going backwards in some ways. Stuff that we thought was heading in one direction, it's sort of bringing up to me memories of the 90s and people who were there earlier saying, well, this reminds me of the 80s and back. So, but again, a lot of this is driven, I think, by the paranoia or the fear of the party that, the US is really kind of cutting them off at the pass, and they have to really double down on new forms of innovation, for example, using AI to compensate for chips they may not be able to build, etc. But it's a pretty high-stakes game.
Sure, but it's not only one way. I mean, the Chinese have also using all sorts of means of pressure when it, lithium and all these rare earth stuff that they have. And of course, they are playing the new geopolitical game very skillfully. Obviously, and the Saudi-Iran deal was a spectacular accomplishment in that respect. And it certainly also has to do with the fact that they need the oil and they need the financing again of, new sources of financing.
I mean, to some extent, China often becomes a mirror, right, for our own weaknesses and our own concerns, and we often, sometimes we blame things on China, but it does reveal a lot about us, our own neuralgia, to some extent, the glass may be half full or half empty, but it's made in China. You kind of need China to define your own future at this point. And I guess the question is how much alliance there will be in the West, as you said, when there are differing commercial interests, or even within Europe, and how much is China able to play on that to prevent a bloc emerging that's really going to stunt their path forward.
But again, I think our problem in Europe is that we are stuck with a very wrong representation of the world because of Mercator. Mercator was Belgian, which is why, but that was in the 16th century, 15th century.
Yeah.
But we always look at the map of the world, you know, and Europe is kind of
In the middle.
in the middle. Now, if you look at the Chinese map, of course, China is in the middle, and the world suddenly looks very, very,
Very
different.
different, yeah.
And what is interesting is that apparently now, for all those parts of Siberia, now Chinese names have been put in place instead of Russian names.
They never recognized Russian names for a number of cities, actually.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, given the talk of, you know, and we don't really go into that, but you mentioned, of course, the Russia-China alliance, let's say, over Ukraine, but they're...
It's not an alliance, it's a friendship.
Friendship, there you go.
No,
Best friendship.
It's, you know, much more than I do about the Chinese official vocabulary, but I think it's important they never say alliance.
True. We have a great group of people, many of whom have lived in China, traveled to China, around the room. I'm going to open up the floor, and we also have the ability to take questions to our online audience, some of whom are in Asia. Any questions? Pierre, I see you there. Just walked in. Some of our supporters, Asia Society of France, thank you for joining us. Anyone like to raise a question? I'll repeat the question for the recording. 中文, 法语, English, anything? Japanese. We've stunned you into silence. I should have seeded a question. Do you have? Right. Oh, there's one in the box. I just see discussion, red flag. Please. No. Oh,
no,
we would help you to ask a question. No? Wow. Okay. This is what you call autocensure, no? Self-censorship, but yeah.
Yes. Yes.
The question is just what has happened in the last month since the book came out. There's a second volume coming.
Well, I'm working on the follow-up.
D'accord, okay.
Well, Beaufan just vanished. Renaissance, that was
Renaissance
the name
Capital,
of...
yeah. It's my classmate from Morgan Stanley. He's a friend, actually. That's very concerning.
And so you certainly know much more than I do, but from what I could read, the guy just vanished. The moment he wanted to move to Singapore, or
potentially, yeah. We don't know the
like
full story.
a few others who managed in due time. So that was interesting. Then there have been, as of late, these new police controls of all the foreign consultants groups. There's also a new law about security and spying, which is due to apply on July 1st, which is widening and harshening the fact that all Chinese and all those who work in China have to report to authorities whatever they deem suspicious or whoever they think is not behaving correctly. So it seems that the control system is getting harsher and harsher. And again, the fact that, as I mentioned, the fact that you would have provinces going to the Gulf for money. I mean, there are all sorts of signs which are fascinating. It's a fast-moving scene. But ever since March, when, as I understand it, but I speak under Duncan's control, Xi Jinping, as I understand it, not only did he put in place a government composed of men, there's not even one token woman anymore, by the way, so men who had followed him in every step of his own career within the party system. There's now another stratum on top of the ministries of the party.
The party, correct. Fusion, really, of the party.
I mean, it's amazing. It's like a millefeuille. But un millefeuille rouge. Enfin, il y a quand même beaucoup de strates. And so it's interesting the way the regime itself, it seems to me, is evolving. As indeed Xi's obsession and all his speeches from day one have been, let us not do the same mistake as the Soviet Union. So let us reinforce the party, whatever it takes. And that seems to be really the main axis of his, de son règne, comment je dirais ça en anglais?
His reign.
His
Yeah.
reign.
No, I thought you did a good job in the book also of describing how different, China's growth of the last few decades has been to the collapse in the Soviet Union of, whatever would have been the middle class, or, the kleptocracy that emerged with the fall of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And actually it was the private sector that built, millions of small companies and millions of jobs that, we didn't see this, collapse and concentration of wealth at the political class. Of course, what we have seen is, like the United States, the 1% of China is similar to the 1% of the United States, a massive concentration of wealth in more recent years, partly due to technology and private equity and things like that. But we didn't, we have seen a very large middle class emerge and is still thriving to a great degree and have very high expectations for their future. And now the big question, which is a question in the West too, is will children have the same lifestyle? Their parents, that was sort of a given, is no longer. And you talk about the Tangping, the lie flat movement that's happening in China. People are kind of dialing back their own ambitions. Or, how much of this is a generational challenge around the world, and how much do you think China is somewhat different?
Well, I think the pressure in the Chinese culture, and of course the Chinese political system, are much stronger or much harsher than they may be in our democratic systems. But the comparison with Russia is interesting because, many people say, oh, you've just written another book about oligarchs. It so happened that I wrote a book about Russian oligarchs about 8 or 9 years ago because I found it was a very interesting way to try and understand how the Putin system worked. And it's totally different.
That's right.
And that's why I think one cannot use the same vocabulary. There's no such thing as Chinese oligarchs.
That's right.
It's totally different. But, and I think that what again, but you know many more of those than I do, but whenever I've had a chance to talk to my Chinese friends, who are, not all billionaires, far from, but first of all, there's that extraordinary pride of being Chinese. And that is a dimension which I think we in the West underestimate.
That's right.
And people or journalists here in Paris, and sometimes journalists do read books. Not always, but sometimes you're lucky and there's actually one who's read the book. And then they say, but, how do you explain that these very rich people do not actually fight the communist system? And I think that is another dimension that we find very difficult to understand, that all these people have actually grown within the system and they know no other system. And I think that is also something which we in the West do not quite understand.
I think it's probably one of the biggest casualties of the whatever relationship between Russia and China in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, is that there is this tendency to then even more apply that lens of, kleptocrats and to China when it's so different. And even the fact of Jack Ma's disappearance, people say, oh, is he going to be thrown out a window? And, it's very different. The Chinese system is much more sophisticated.
Indeed.
So Jack Ma is able to travel, as we've seen. He has reappeared in China recently. But if you notice, what he's allowed to speak about is very, very narrow. It's about agricultural technology and education. And here's somebody who should be telling us all about the future of AI and generative, and he's on mute. Latest rumor is he's going to take back control of Alibaba. I can't really see how that's going to happen, but there's a new rumor that he's coming back. Jack is back, so that'd be my next book. But for now, you know, this gentleman, you know, it is politics, which is trumping everything.
But maybe if I may.
Please, good, yes.
Jack Ma, you know, it's different.
Mm-hmm.
He was but completely jeopardizing the financial system.
Good point.
So that was not.
He was criticizing, yeah.
Yeah, and with his MP and with the new company, he was not really.
Absolutely.
Putting a mess. So he's so different from the others.
Exactly. And you write about that, and you describe that very effectively, how large this thing was and lack of regulation of financial. I mean, looking back now with what we've seen with Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic, I mean, in a sense, you kind of think the Chinese government was onto something with this crackdown.
But am I wrong, or the very day that Jack Ma reappeared in China, it was announced that Ant Group was split into 8 different units.
So actually, the Alibaba group would be broken up. The Ant is still, we're still working.
Oh, the Alibaba
but
group.
The whole Alibaba group was split into 6
the
or so.
very same day, which
Yes,
I thought was another extraordinarily perverse way to actually signify that the end of Jack Ma was over.
I mean, but you're right. I mean, in some ways, you know, China is a model for showing how you can regulate large business groups, which the US has famously not done at all, which is fueling a lot of, you know, problems, as we've seen, you know, populism potentially linked to people very frustrated that no bankers were arrested in the 2008. I think it was one Chinese bank in New York that was targeted. But other than that, nobody was accountable for this terrible mess that was created. So you're right. So please, you have a question.
I'm an retired government official from the United Arab Emirates. I'm Korean American.
Well,
my question is to the panel. Do you believe the Politburo, when drawing the 3 red lines to maybe curb the anti-financial and financial system and create more favorable regulations for the Minister of Finance, the financial system as a whole, calculated the externality of Evergrande and the real estate sector in doing so?
Yeah, so the red lines are describing relating to the property sector and how.
But really related to my understanding, they were really focused on the tech sector, right? Mostly around financial.
There's 2 sets of there's a lot of red lines, so yeah.
A lot of red lines.
That comes out in your book. It's like, and they're not very clear, these red lines, but you're right. I mean, what were they trying to achieve, and did they underestimate the impact?
The impact on the real estate sector, physically Evergrande.
You write about Country Garden as well. You have a lot,
Country Garden, and the last results of Country Gardens are even worse because obviously it's a whole. But there has been some refinancing of Evergrande, not enough because they're really in a very bad condition. But Country Gardens was probably politically better considered.
I think so.
And so they had more financial rescue, so to speak. But I think that there are many more developers who are really in trouble because it's the whole system that's been in shambles.
And, you know, if you look at the equity stack of Evergrande, right, most of it was foreign bonds, right? Bondholders. That I don't know if there was ever a resolution on the bill.
It's a very long term. I think they'll get stuff in 10 years, and they just kick the can down the road. So, but you're right. It's had a major impact, as we've heard, on local government finances, but also the psyche of consumers. I mean, China, is. I think we had Ronnie Chan actually from Asia Society Hong Kong with us a few days ago. He said we're not seeing a V-shaped recovery in China. It's more of an L or a U. I mean, and partly that's linked, I think, to property. You know, people have so much tied up in it, and also the employment situation. So there was a bet that some investors made on a very quick recovery of China. It hasn't really paid off.
And so you're absolutely right. We've seen a lot of Chinese local firms in the United Arab Emirates and in the Middle East speaking to different royal families and different government chiefs, different enterprises.
And have they been successful? I mean,
that's not for me to say. I can only comment on the influx on 3 levels of Chinese expatriates moving into Singapore, Hong Kong, more Singapore, United Arab Emirates.
I think it's 400,000 or more in UAE of Chinese living in the UAE, or maybe 600,000.
It was one of the largest inflows in 2022 and 2023.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a good point that how much are we influenced by a kind of more Western-centric media lens on stuff that's really happening we may not understand fully, like the Chinese investment in the UAE and beyond, the dependency that's emerging perhaps there. It's fascinating to think about these changes, yeah. Yes, Pierre.
One of my business associates has been still adopted to the Julian that China is going to play the long game on Taiwan by making Hong Kong prosper again, to show that you can come, it's all going to be good, real Chinese, and economic be good. Do you see any likelihood of such an approach?
The question for the audiences online is China's approach to Hong Kong, will they make it a success to reassure people in Taiwan to play the long game, which is what was expected but wasn't really experienced in the last few years. But are they going to go back to that? Yeah. Right. Right. You do describe Taiwan a bit in the book, but obviously business lens.
It's a little bit out of. But you know much more about Hong Kong. It seems that there is no great enthusiasm among foreign investors to go back to Hong Kong. And I think that today, a Chinese American or an American Chinese
was arrested
and condemned to death.
No, I think 20 years. 20 years in prison.
No, I think
30 years in prison, and he's 76, so that's definitely.
Yeah, well, that's. Anyway, I mean.
He's a Hong Kong permanent resident, but he's an American citizen.
American citizen.
I mean, Professor, I would say that Hong Kong is probably benefiting right now from hesitancy of some Western investors to actually go to the mainland, given all these headlines about what's happening with Bain and elsewhere. But in Hong Kong, okay, for booksellers and you describe also the Chinese billionaire who's taken from the Four Seasons apartments in Hong Kong, has had some issues for Chinese billionaires. But for Westerners, I think Hong Kong is still seen as a pretty safe place to conduct business. And actually the mainland may not be as attractive for them. So there may be more of a role that Hong Kong's going to play in the near to medium term. We do see a more pragmatic government in Hong Kong in terms of the economy, of course, ending zero COVID, even a bit before mainland. In fact, it's interesting that Hong Kong opened to the West or to the international world earlier than they opened back to the mainland of China, which many people didn't expect. So I think John Lee, who's current chief executive, seems to have more of a team, pragmatic approach to business, which is But at long term, there's massive questions about Taiwan. But I would say, having just been in Hong Kong, I found it's bounced back quite quickly actually versus say Shanghai and I feel some confidence coming back, but still issues long term: education, sense of self, identity. But the most interesting conversations you have, I find, in Hong Kong are mainland Chinese who have moved to Hong Kong. And yes, there are restrictions in HongOng that have come, but boy, do they have a better life there in terms of freedom of the internet. Although ChatGPT, interestingly, does not make itself available in Hong Kong.
No, and they don't have TikTok anymore.
No,
they have Douyin. The very day the law was applied, TikTok was out.
So one company, two systems. There's lots of good jokes around Hong Kong. But you're right. I mean, Hong Kong is a very interesting place right now for that, But for mainland Chinese, talented mainland Chinese who are moving to Hong Kong, maybe they'll get a Hong Kong passport in, 7 years. It's not bad, actually. They're getting, perhaps a better deal than they would staying in the mainland right now. So that's interesting. I mean, anytime you get talent, where's the talent going? I mean, that's so interesting. There are a lot of talented Chinese coming out of China now, some of Hong Kong, but I see a lot in Japan where I spend half the time. Singapore is full. Try and rent an apartment in Singapore. Yes.
They love Singapore, and for them it's very easy because there is a sort of mutual respect.
Correct.
Between those two governments, no matter what.
But you need a lot of money to open an office in Singapore. I think it's.
I'm available for speaking engagements in Singapore when they pay the hotel. But it's interesting that Singapore's had a massive influx, as you described in the book, of family offices. And in the book, I think it says 10 million minimum. I think it's up to 30 or 6. It just keeps changing. But what's interesting is now the Singapore government is no longer releasing details on where the capital is coming into these family offices, because it is clearly a lot of it's coming from mainland China. But if you're a sort of Rolls-Royce dealer in Singapore, you're doing all right now.
Yeah, you're doing a...
I think one interesting caveat on Hong Kong is there's this past digital asset regulation, right? Which is very not regulated or not even proposed China is using Hong Kong as an innovation
Yes.
sandbox, much like Hainan. But it'll be interesting to see over the next 5-10 years how digital assets play, and if there is a willingness to use it as a sandbox, and how that will kind of like reinvigorate their economy as it competes with Singapore now, as it competes with United States.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you mentioned, I mean, one thing that isn't in the book, which I agree with because I get sick of it, is the whole crypto, thing. But there was, China's a big part of the global crypto revolution, right? Partly because of capital controls in China. And quite a lot of people actually moved from China to Dubai and elsewhere to get away from controls in China. Once they flipped very quickly, like they did on the education sector. Suddenly it went from one to the other. But the Chinese government is trying to, catch up with the innovation, I think. And I think Hong Kong seems to be a place where they're going to experiment. So, these are very innovative people. Even the bureaucrats are innovative, which is hard to understand in certain countries in Europe. But, they understand a lot of this. And, the question is, can they adapt, like with ChatGPT? Is there a way to maintain control and allow innovation? It's fascinating.
Did we talk about new development bank in Delta Road and digital yuan and global trade and trade partners?
And the book on...
Well, it's, I mean,
mostly on the private sector. I mean, the sector is about the private sector.
It's only 259 pages.
Oh,
there's a moment where...
Yeah. But I think the lens of I think it's great to throw this lens on the private sector. I mean, even the definition of the private sector as well comes through. I mean, was Anbang a private company? Was even HNA a private company? Not really. But, but it's interesting. Or Huawei, famously. I mean, we haven't even mentioned the word Huawei. Yeah. But I mean, describing itself as a private company because there's a registered share, a little bit difficult to...
It is.
Exactly. Constantly rotating CEOs.
Well, no, it's the daughter.
She's now in charge.
That's interesting because it's no longer the rotation.
Yes.
It's the heroine of Vancouver.
And that naturally, you said she wore a red dress. She said this is the color of China, but you said it was a French brand, an American brand.
An American designer.
Okay.
Which was funny.
Yeah, discuss the contradictions.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the point you make is to understand China, you have to be able to have these insane contradictions in your head at the same time and be okay with it. I think Simon Lay is the great sinologist who said that. I mean, Belgian. That's true. Belgian went to Australia, but he's Belgian, right? Yeah. So the Belgians, understand China. You follow the Belgians. We have some here. So. But those contradictions are, in a sense, this shouldn't have happened, this economic explosion with this political control, but it has.
No, but that's Deng Xiaoping's genius.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Hainan.
Shenzhen.
How it all started.
When you talk with communist leaders, you really focus on Hainan.
Yeah.
And say, oh, we don't care so much about Hong Kong.
Right.
Economy is important in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It is Hainan. And all those rich guys, they try to have connection and to do business. However, in Hainan.
It's true.
I voted to do it. I just started. So I don't know if you mentioned Hainan.
Oh, it's a lot. It's a lot of
Hainan. It's the first chapter.
But here's an example. I've been to Hainan a few times in the last 2 years as part of trade delegations, and they really do. You're right. They're really trying to. It's almost like a backup Hong Kong, or trying to replace Hong Kong. For example, selling yachts. For example, they've changed the law so you can trade. There's been an international yacht trading area, or free trade.
Yeah,
no visa.
Trade,
no visa for tourists. So. Mm-hmm. And, if you talk to Kering and LVMH, I mean, the amounts being sold in Sanya. But also Haikou, the capital, is very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of international schools coming. It's quite impressive to visit Hainan and see that development. And it's so close to Vietnam. It's amazing. You look on the map, you're like, oops. It's, this is obviously their, foray into that area. Yeah.
They are not sure about Taiwan. They want it, but so for them, Hainan is still better than nothing.
Yeah.
In order to free trade in Southeast.
That's right, and we do see a lot of trade. You're right. Southeast Asia, China trade is increasing. I mean, yeah, of course, it's natural. Yeah. But one thing's interesting, but I've had some discussions with government officials in Hainan where they say, well, we're going to have the free internet. And you say, really? But we're just about to implement it because they want that. That would be the thing that would really change for them because they have cloud computing companies, but they can't really get to that. So the question is China capped by these controls, for innovation or not?
So many companies.
VPNs.
They are all using proxies.
Mm-hmm. Technically illegal.
But not, I mean, not ordinary people. I mean, to get back to what was new. I mean, since I was amazed to see a picture. I think it was in the Financial Times, in a bus in Shanghai, where you could see a policeman checking the phones of the passengers to see whether they had VPN access or not. And that is in a bus in Shanghai. And that shows that there is a degree of concern. Now, is it a local initiative? I mean, that's always the mystery.
After the protest, I think, was it?
No,
Oh,
3 weeks ago.
Okay.
3 or 4 weeks ago.
But it's only really the tourists because all of they're using direct routers, right? So they're using rotating routers on the phone and have
No, but the fact that there would be a police effort to try and see, okay, you know, what do you have on your phone? It's interesting.
Let's go right to digital detox. Go to China. You can, it's wonderful. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Which one of them do you have more sympathy or
Pick your favorite billionaire is the question.
My that's an American musical. You know, my favorite Chinese billionaire. That would be a hit on Broadway. That would be great. My favorite Chinese billionaire. I think Yang Zemin is a very interesting guy. Because, you know, ByteDance is an extraordinary company. And the guy who is not even 40 and who suddenly says, well, actually, I'm a very shy person. And so I need to reflect upon the real meaning of life. And so he just walks out and he lets his number two go. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, to what extent is it just, I mean, it's obviously self-protection, but the timing of that was in the wake, when was it, last year? In the wake not only of Jack Ma.
2021, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's, and he's not even 40, so and he created ByteDance, and so, you know, TikTok, there's all that obsession now about TikTok, and you see that TikTok is the partner of the Cannes Festival later this week, that TikTok was the sponsor of the Paris Book Fair, TikTok. And at the same time, you have civil servants in this country and in Brussels who cannot have TikTok on their phones anymore. I mean, it's fascinating, and the fact that I think he's from Singapore, the CEO of TikTok, who was grilled in Congress.
He's Singaporean. Yeah.
Who really
went to Harvard.
Had a tough time.
But Chinese, you know, cheered him on, right? I mean, in China, the questioning from some of the octogenarian senators, and you know, was seen as rude, right? It didn't showcase, you know, Congress in a very positive light in China.
It's really been a huge discussion, right? Because everything is going here and it's not going in another direction.
That's right.
And remember, there are
Please.
Remember, there are two TikToks. There is TikTok for us, and there is
Douyin in China.
No, but of course.
And she describes
but
it.
it's not, and Putin is a very nice guy in Douyin. Very nice guy.
Yeah.
Uncle Putin. Very different story.
Yeah. And then there are those billionaires, and you describe many, but there are some who are out of the country. So Jiang Xin and Pan Xi, you have a chapter on mentioning a lot about Soho, China, you know, and they are in the United States now, and they've decided basically to build their lives there. As you said,
they have no choice.
Really. They weren't able to sell to Blackstone, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, where are the billionaires is also revealing of, you know, what was their relationship with the party, what were the sectors they're involved in, were they seen as approved or not. There's, a lot of people plotting in places like Atherton, California, or Vancouver who feel like, they want to get back into China, but they won't. It's very interesting. There's a diaspora now of very wealthy, powerful people who feel that it's, not going well for them, and others who are in China who similarly think there are big opportunities. So there's quite a spectrum of billionaires. There's so many. I mean,
And some who are in China, and they try to find a B plan in English. I'm not sure.
Plan B? Yeah.
Like they go also to Kuala Lumpur. Singapore or Kuala Lumpur, they do business with factory, and they set about their keys over there, and they think it's so convenient. They want to play safe. So they remain Chinese, they only have one nationality.
Right, one passport is allowed.
One passport. But they stay there for many years. It started during COVID.
That's right.
And when they call them, they say, oh, we're still in KL. But we go back and forth.
That's the irony, is if you wanted to decouple from China and say move your plants to Vietnam or Mexico, the people you're dealing with are Chinese actually are helping you in that process.
They push you. They like the idea.
No, but the fact that there have been these illegal Chinese police stations, not only in New York, but in Holland, in Germany. I think that also creates, how could I put it, a certain unease.
The United Front, the sort of of the party, but no. So how to? I mean, this is the nub of the question is, how do we stay engaged with Chinese friends, culture, without putting everything in the same basket of, and that's the challenge, and particularly in the United States with the terrible sort of racist, incidents that happened over the last few years. Particularly for engineers, like how do you still attract the best and the brightest to come to the West? As people say, attach a green card to the PhD, basically. I mean, you should staple it together. And so follow the talent.
Yeah, but it still works.
It actually more than it did before.
I think when it comes to AI, 2/3 of people working in the US are foreign born.
That's right.
2/3. So it means that the magnet is still very much operational.
Right.
Yeah, and students at Stanford, when they go to IT, they have to organize big quotas in order to
limit the correct.
The Chinese candidates.
I mean, again, once again, it's a mirror to our own education systems. Why are we not graduating enough STEM? Why are we not having enough women? Also, China's done a better job, as you described, in women entrepreneurs in the past, maybe not with Politburo, but there's a lot of things we can learn. I think China's sort of an MSG. What is that in French? The thing. It makes everything tasty, every conversation you have. Monosodium glutamate. What? Weiqi. You put China on any conversation, it's going to taste, stronger. But you're right. I think the talent war, I think this is going to be the key for building the future. Can China still maintain China as an attractive place to move to for Chinese who graduated from the best places to come back? And tellingly, there was one semiconductor firm recently where I think the boss had been Chinese, gone to the States, got a green card, became a US citizen, was enticed back to China, I think about 10 years ago, got arrested a few years ago for corruption. But they just released him and said, okay, back to work. We need your help because, all hands on deck for the semiconductor battle of the US. So it's interesting, the pragmatism that's still there. But what does this mean for other Chinese? Would they want to go back and take the risk? And because China has the 1,000 Talents program, they're actively recruiting talent from around the world, mostly ethnic Chinese, to come back. With Coca-Cola? No, I didn't see that.
The 1,000 Talents program brought a Chinese woman that worked in a Coca-Cola plant in the United States. And she's just been tried for espionage.
Ingredient X.
Oh, yeah.
We are looking for sponsor for Asia Society, but drink Coke, but no, sorry. So no, I mean, that's espionage. That's the question. I mean, how much can you encourage this collaboration with individuals when there's a suspicion? And it's been a horrible situation with scientists in the United States, but elsewhere, accused wrongly of this stuff. So,
I think it depends from where you look at the point, because for us, for Latin Americans, when we are speaking with Americans, we have the same suspicions as if they were Chinese. So I think it's about the bias that we are building against China. And I think that when
you said before that billionaires were like raised in a country where they needed to be fully involved and like fighting for China. I don't think that has changed so much, even for those Chinese students that went to America that experience the Western culture. Most of my Chinese friends that study in the US, they are coming back to China. They are super happy to come back to China
Still.
and build their country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I'm afraid, I'm 30, I study at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and what I'm afraid now is that people from my generation are really, most of them, I would say, I don't know if you say like 90% of the people with whom I speak, they have a very strong anti-China sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
Even here in Paris, it's pretty strong. Even from la gauche, le droit, from laquelle origine, even in Argentina, or even if you speak in America. And I think that's something that I thought it would be changing with the future, but I think it's getting worse.
Well, it's very difficult to go to China, isn't it? I mean, right now, very few programs. I mean, Pedro came through the Schwarzman program at Tsinghua. I think when I read, and I was mentor to some of the Schwarzman scholars, I think at the moment there's something like 283 Americans studying in China. Insane. When look at the economic relationship, and the other way around is massively different. So, any thoughts on and the French European China link is also it's very hard. I mean, in fact, Chinese, we work with people like Inelko. I mean, the hot language is Korean, and Japanese is back now. So it's no longer 10 years ago when every hedge fund manager wanted to have their Chinese, their kids speak Chinese and impress everybody. So you're right. So this lack of people to people is dangerous. Right? Contact, But you can understand why people are not rushing that. The image that they're getting, or the difficulty to go there.
It happens to me at the place here in France. I have tons of books of China. Every time that I have my friends coming to my place, they are like, "Oh, I don't understand how you support this regime." Wait, there's so much to discuss. And I think in Argentina, just to give an example, we are going for decades through a very complicated economic situation. Every time that the US tried to help us with the IMF, the situation got worse. And when we are trying to look for another way of saving our economy or engaging with China or with Asia, we know that if you are in power, you will have like bad times with Washington. So I feel that there's like for poorer countries or countries like they are trying to develop their economies, when they are trying to like build a smarter or different relationship with China or even with other Asian countries, we know that that's going to mean in the years to come like a really bad situation in the United States. And that's create for Latin America a terrible vision about China, a terrible vision about Asia. Like if you ask to 95% of politicians in Latin America if they know anything about China, that they have supermarkets in Asia, in America, in Latin America.
But isn't it Argentina who is now selling soybeans in yuan, in renminbi,
so we got
evading the dollar?
Exactly. But because of that, now the IMF
going after
is stopping the money that it was supposed to come to Argentina by the month of July. I'm not justifying the bad way that we manage the economy, but I mean like it's very tricky. I don't know, I think that it really, my experience at Schwarzman was very interesting to see how people from developed countries see China and how those from developing countries, I think we have a different perspective.
And Pedro's very modest, but he was actually the youngest minister of the Argentinian government, right? So he has something to, anything that was the other guys, but also the Africa link, of course, and it's something we've at our launch event, Valérie.
Yeah, but it's not only very happy experiences.
No,
it's patchy, right?
And especially in Africa. With all the loans, I mean, it's becoming very, very tricky.
I think that that's a very tricky and hot topic to discuss because it is true, there are many examples in Africa. How many examples do we have of the French and the Americans in Latin America? It's history. If you look at the way that not Germany, but France and Spain, they have not diversified the Latin American economy, explains many of the reasons why we are so poor as well. So I know that China has been making a lot of mistakes in Africa, or like policy decisions, but we don't see so many differences from the decisions of the United States and America. So now it's up to us to decide with whom we want to negotiate.
Well, and I think one thing, Christine, with your lens again on the private sector in China, what's very interesting is when you go to places like Africa and the Middle East and looking at the private sector players from China in there versus the very state-driven Belt and Road, take me to your leader kind of approach. And that's quite interesting. I mean, the one city of Wenzhou in Zhejiang, I was just in Spain where like every Chinese person I met is from Wenzhou, but I'm sure the same is true in Argentina. I mean, unbelievable. I write about it in my book as well, but that province of Zhejiang, as you described, I think it's a third of all the billionaires in China from Wenzhou.
Yeah,
I mean, it's incredible. And there's almost no state there in the past. So I think what we all...
Maybe that's why.
Well, exactly. I would think. I mean, so nuance is one thing. Exactly. It's a good French word. We should try and make nuance great again. Because there's more than one China, right? And so looking at that, like what are Chinese private sector players doing in South America and Africa? And how do they relate to the government?
And
Sometimes they're getting away.
The private sector in China?
And it's changing, right? I mean, as we're
No,
saying.
but what are, the gray, you explained that to me very well months ago. The gray, gray is a great Chinese color.
Yes.
The gray zone, what is private, what is semi-private, what is state control, what is semi-state control. That's part of the mystery.
Yeah. But China is experiencing problems, of course, with the Belt and Road initiative. I mean, just take Sudan right now. I mean, they're on the hook for, what, 5 billion, I think, right now. And it's going to be very worrying. Sudan has a very large, impressive embassy in Beijing, which means there's been a lot of, loans going in. And so China is experiencing tough stuff now about, the responsibility of this as well that we've all been through, right? So, but you're right. I think that's a very important point about the different lens of the South, global South with China versus...
Yeah, in the South is not that global. I mean, it's an interesting wording, but it's too simplistic. I mean,
I think that might add, if you look at the leading trade partners in China, it's mostly China.
That's right.
Four countries in Central America, Taiwan, China.
Oh yeah, but that's diminishing.
Yeah, of course. But just to put in perspective, we're talking Latin America is not so favorable, or has a very interesting relationship with China. But the data suggests that there's a large trade partner.
And we see President Biden, who's not a young man, going from the G7 in Hiroshima to Papua New Guinea, right, to make the first, I think, presidential visit, I believe, to PNG, where, of course, China has been doing a lot there, including telecommunications and investments. So with the Quad and all this stuff. So it's all, we're all squaring off against each other. But, in a depressing moments, I mean, how much do we think that we're reliving, say, the history of, say, Japan in the 1930s, which felt deprived of resources and obliged to head in the wrong, or is that too dark a sentiment? Now, by boxing China in, are we forcing them to take the wrong steps, or is this, as you described, is this inevitable based on what China is doing?
Well, I'm not sure we're not boxing China in. I mean, and China is boxing back. I mean, there was that moment where China joined
the
OMC,
the WHO in 2001. Yeah.
And so...
Sorry, WTO, not WHO. We've still got pandemic on our minds, yeah.
WTO.
Of course, WTO.
But, I mean, China is very good at getting into the game and not playing the rules. So it's not,
It could be British.
Could be.
That's a low blow.
Yes, They're faring somehow better. I don't want to be rude to the Brits, but for the time being, it's not.
Ludovic, we have, from a perspective of a French person active in Beijing still, right?
Yes, in Beijing, so 19 years in Beijing, doing tech investment. And in 19 years, this year I saw for the first time something new in the tech industry. If you look at the last few years, maybe like 3, 4, 5 years, at the new billionaires, the ones that have been billionaires faster than we've done before, they come from the tech industry, they build companies like BitMain and Binance, who are literally companies 100% tech, 100% global, almost 100% built in China with Chinese people in Shanghai industry, and 0% revenue from China. The legal structure is not in China, it's in Cayman, Singapore, wherever, France maybe tomorrow, who knows. And I think there is a big wave right now of Chinese entrepreneurs building tech companies that will target first Europe and Southeast Asia.
Middle East even.
As a way to get out?
As a way to come back to China later as a non-Chinese company. But obviously they will operate way better than any Western company in China the day they will be in a real transition. And this is the fastest way to have become, as an investor, to have become very rich in the last few years, was to invest in the Chinese entrepreneur, building a company from China, targeting the rest of the world. And I see this as a big trend.
And Pinduoduo is subsidiary to Mu, where they registered in Dublin, right? So the Chinese companies that are Chinese do not want to be seen as Chinese, but they're operating with the efficiency of Chinese companies.
Yeah, and they are very flexible, very agile. If they need to move tomorrow to Singapore, they move to Singapore. If they need to move to another country, they do it. And they will operate worldwide. And so I think this trend will continue. And what I find interesting also is like before it was like Southeast Asia would be the target, India would be the target, maybe Latin America somehow would be the target. Now Europe is the target.
And how do you explain that?
It's called the return on advertising spend. It's way cheaper because less competition to go and buy advertising in Europe because there is less company well capitalized. So you can buy big inventory from Facebook, Instagram, Google at a way cheaper price with bigger return on advertising spend than if you do that in territories where there is big VC, big venture capitalists investing in companies. So India is for sure not the target anymore. Southeast Asia, there is a lot of money, so competition is very tough also. But Europe, super cheap.
Another area that I'm
Open
hearing
market.
is the electric vehicles, for example. I mean, Europe has very big, ambitious goals, of course, to decarbonize. As we know, the batteries you describe, and maybe it's not always that environmentally friendly, but the shift to EV, China is a massive player.
Yeah.
But these Chinese EV companies are really not going to be able to use Baidu here and things like that. So there's actually an integration opportunity for software companies in Europe to work with these Chinese EV platforms. So you're right, I'm hearing more and more about Europe as an attractive market. So back Chinese, not necessarily China. So what is a private company? And what is a Chinese company? Both of these definitions are fluid. So
my question is, as someone who's been in China for 19 years, likes China and likes Chinese people and so on, is how this will benefit or not to China. Because this money is basically in Singapore or Yemen or BPI or whatever, and people might not have, Chinese people might not benefit that much from the future. So compared to 10 cents,
compared to the previous decade. Yeah.
It's a little bit more.
So it's become real capitalism.
Mercenaries.
And it's, it can be happening in unexpected places. I live part-time in Japan now, and there's estimates of 2 million Chinese living in Japan. And one thing I found, I'm learning Japanese slowly, but anytime I get to a situation I can't really communicate, I try Chinese, and odds are they're actually Chinese. They speak very good Japanese, so we just switched to Chinese. And the Chinese, they make even a place like Japan, which is traditionally quite moribund and bureaucratic, they know how to hack it. The Chinese, they just figure out how it works. Because they work through WeChat, they have networks. I mean, they're very effective. Also simple things like the quality of food in Paris. It's not just, Asian food with Thai and, there are now every province, every city of China. We saw that first in London with this wave of Chinese. So there's a wonderful flourishing of, good things about Chinese culture, happening elsewhere by this diaspora. As you said, what's that relationship long term? Will they go back? Are they here to stay? It's very fluid also. Yeah. Please.
I think Pedro and yourself touched on it, right? Like, the Chinese people are not the Chinese government, and we also work in that the Russian people are not the Russian government,
right? And
the American people are not Donald Trump.
Thank God. Sorry. Yeah.
I think we always have to remind ourselves of these differences. That what the governance, the leadership of a country does is not necessarily representative of the people. We need to remember the humanity in the world and forget the government.
You raise a good question. Let's take the horrible nightmare scenario that Donald Trump is in again, right? January 2020. what does that do? I mean, where does Europe go in that position?
Do you really have to get us
sorry.
into a nightmare?
It's my French side. It's,
I mean, the world is difficult as it is now. Okay. So let's not project something really. No, but you're right. I mean, it certainly won't improve. He will, of course, solve the war in Ukraine in 2 days.
24 hours, I think. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's for sure. But it certainly will not help the whole China-US confrontation, because that's his administration, actually, which... and Bannon, I mean, there are all sorts of guys who we have mercifully forgotten about. But all these ideologues have been extremely decisive in more so to speak, than the capitalist analysis of what has to be done with a Chinese company. Right. But these ideologues were at work before and within the Trump administration. And so that's how it all started.
And
somehow.
Maybe we didn't touch enough on it, but President Macron's trip to China and the critiques that came in.
I was hoping you would not.
Well, I mean, how much do you think is an Anglosphere criticisms versus, was it fair, do you think? I mean, he had 2 interviews, right? One was, I think, Jamil Andolini and a colleague from Politico. That was not good.
The problem was not so much what he said or didn't say when he was in China. It was on the way back from China in the plane.
Yeah.
Our president has a very bad habit of speaking too much in planes. And so he had already slipped somehow. His tongue had slipped when he was flying back from the Munich conference that was back in a few months ago, February. No, but it was really bad timing, bad wording, and I mean, it was just not right to say we don't care about Taiwan. But it was interesting that, of course, the French press printed was not quite the same as Politico. And it was certainly a huge mistake by the communication guy at the Élysée to have the president speak to these 3 journalists at the same time. There was Pieraski, a guy from Les Echos.
Yes.
And someone from Politico.
So do they serve wine on board the French president? Or it sounds like they need better in-flight entertainment to keep him busy with not giving journalists...
No, but certainly, I mean, no, and the pity is that the idea of European sovereignty and the idea that there are European concerns and interests which are not the same as the American ones is a very correct one and a very important one within, I mean, and especially with the war going on.
He just said what he was thinking, but he sometimes not.
No, I mean, he again, he's been saying these ideas for quite a few years now, correctly, but the way he said it, and again, the timing was way, in my view, very important.
If I may say
yeah, please.
About this, I was going to explain that, and he doesn't need me to be defended, but he never said that he didn't care about Taiwan.
No, the wording was, no, he said it's too far away from our...
Yes, that's the second, second line issue, but he never said that. And honestly, if you listen to the words he said, especially if in a few years we got a Trump back to power, we will find these words very, very true. And indeed, if you want to build a strategic economy, then you have to be consistent with it. And it's not about saying to Chinese, we love you and turn you back.
No, you're right.
We choose our allies, and if we intervene in one way or another, it is because we want it. We do it.
I fully agree with you.
And honestly, I think there's nothing to say about this.
No, but he shouldn't have said that flying back from Beijing.
Yeah.
And especially at the time where there was a French frigate in the shorts, in the Taiwan shorts. Because France also is an Indo-Pacific power, and indeed it is so geographically and so on and so forth. So the apparent contradiction in his wording.
You're talking to an interpreter to the French presidents in the past. So.
I do not see where the wrong word is. The only thing I'm sorry, I'm not blaming the media, but I think they have been really overreacting with the kind of silent utilization of his words. To me, I felt that like a Macron bashing outside of France. I mean, inside France, we get used to it.
Yeah, inside France, it's become
on this question, honestly, I'd like someone to tell me what should have been said and what is the wrong word.
Maybe nothing? Is that a problem for Macron? Well, I think we're running out of time, but I wanted to, unless there's any pressing questions, I haven't looked enough on this side, I'm sorry. But it's been such a fascinating discussion. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend, and so you're going to enjoy it. It's a great reference book as well. I learned many things about some of the, the early days of individual entrepreneurs. It's a big subject. I think you've done a masterful job at capturing it.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you again for your contribution.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming today, and hope you can join Asia Society France.